The House of Silence. The Hamilton mansion stood like a fortress of glass and steel on the edge of the city, a monument to wealth and power that had been built not for joy but for control. Its wide windows looked down on the skyline, but inside, every curtain was always drawn tight. Though the sun painted golden streaks across the high-rises, here the room stayed dim, cloaked in heavy drapes that kept light out as though it were an enemy. The quiet inside was not the quiet of peace, but the heavy, suffocating silence of despair. For 7 years, that silence had been the companion of Richard Hamilton, a man whose empire in technology and finance had made him one of the wealthiest figures in America. Yet none of it mattered. For all the billions he earned, for all the influence he commanded, his 2 children, his twin sons, Marcus and Samuel, lived in a world where morning and evening were no different, where color and brightness did not exist. They were blind from birth. From the moment they were delivered, hope had slipped through his fingers. His wife, Elena, had not survived the birth, and in that same moment, the doctors gave him the second tragedy. Both boys were blind. No one knew why. There was no single cause that medicine could name. All they said was that their sight had never developed, that the world for them would remain forever black. In the first years, Richard spared nothing. He called specialists from Boston, London, Berlin, and Tokyo. The best pediatric ophthalmologists examined the twins, put them through countless tests, and all came to the same conclusion. It was impossible. No surgery, no medicine, no miracle cure. The twins would never see. With each failure, Richard's heart became heavier, but he did not give up. He burned through millions in the attempt, yet each time the result was the same: nothing. By the time Marcus and Samuel turned setiod, even, Richard had become a shell of the man he once was. His business thrived because he could throw himself into work, but his home was a cage filled with sorrow. The twins rarely laughed, for laughter had no echo in their world. Their nanny, Martha, kept them fed and safe, but her patience had worn thin. She treated them as fragile glass that might shatter at any touch. She kept them quiet, controlled, and never let them step into the possibility of discovery. Richard himself stayed away from them more often than not because he did not love them, but because the weight of his helplessness pressed on him until he could not breathe. He could command empires, but he could not give his sons a single drop of light. On one gray morning, when rain tapped softly against the mansion's windows, Richard sat alone in his office, staring at the floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with leather-bound books. He had not opened one in months. His thoughts drifted between guilt for not being enough for his sons and anger at a universe that had taken both his wife and his children's sight. The intercom buzzed, breaking the heavy air. His house manager, Celia, announced quietly, "Sir, the candidate for the housekeeping position has arrived." Richard rubbed his temples, not in the mood for formalities, but the household needed help. He pressed the button. "Send her in." A few minutes later, footsteps echoed across the marble hallway. Into the office stepped a woman with calm eyes and steady posture. She wore a modest shirt and jeans, her shoes plain but clean. Her hair was tied back, and she carried no arrogance, only a quiet strength. Her name was Grace Johnson, and though her resume spoke of experience in domestic work, it did not reveal the deeper truth, that she carried with her a heart that had once walked through grief of its own. She had cared for a younger brother who had lost his sight in an accident, and though he had passed away years later, she had never forgotten the small discoveries they had made together, the games of sound and touch, the careful experiments with light. She did not claim to be a miracle worker, but she carried within her the conviction that children deserved more than pity and silence. Richard glanced at her resume, then at her face. He spoke without much energy. "The salary is generous. The work is demanding. I have only one condition. Do not interfere with my children's therapy." He stumbled slightly on the last word, as though it pained him even to say it. "I cannot allow anyone to give them false hope. They've had enough of that. I've had enough of that." Grace nodded slowly. "I don't give false promises, sir. I'll do my job. But I believe every child deserves patience. not just routine. Richard's tired eyes lingered on her for a moment. Something in her tone was different from the dozens of people he had interviewed before. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't pity, it was steadiness. He signed the paper and handed it back. "You start tomorrow." The next morning the mansion woke as it always did, with silence. The twins sat in their room, small bodies curled into oversized chairs, rocking gently as they often did to comfort themselves. Martha sat nearby, her eyes on her phone, barely glancing at he boys. When Grace arrived, she greeted them softly. "Good morning." Her voice was warm, not loud, not demanding. Marcus turned his head slightly, his ears sharper than most. "Who's there?" he asked cautiously. "I'm Grace," she replied, kneeling closer to their level. "I'll be helping around the house. Would you like to help me today?" The boys hesitated. They were used to voices that spoke about them, not to them. They were used to being managed, not invited. Grace pulled a small keychain from her pocket. Attached was a little bell. She shook it gently, the sound crisp and cheerful. Both boys lifted their heads at once. Samuel reached out a hand. "What's that?" "It's a bell," she said, placing it in his palm. "It sings when you move it." Samuel shook it and laughter burst from his lips, sudden and bright. Marcus joined in, reaching for it, the sound drawing him forward. For the first time in weeks, the room filled with something other than silence. Martha frowned. "Miss Johnson, your job is cleaning, not entertaining." Grace smiled politely but did not move away from the boys. "Sometimes the best cleaning is to sweep away the silence," she replied softly. The twins giggled again, passing the bell back and forth, and in that moment, Grace knew something the others did not. Their world was not empty, only unexplored. As the day went on, Grace began to notice the small details others ignored. The boys tilted their heads when she walked near windows. Their bodies stiffened when curtains shifted, even though they had been told since birth that light would hurt them. She watched carefully, never pushing, never forcing, but she began to wonder, what if the darkness was not absolute? What if the world had told them they were broken, when in truth there was still something waiting to be discovered? That night in her small staff room, Grace opened an old notebook. Inside were pages of scribbled notes from years ago, experiments she had done with her brother, games with shadows, lessons with sound, ways to help him sense light without fear. She traced the faded ink with her finger and whispered to herself, "Maybe here, maybe with them." In the great mansion, the curtains still hung heavy, but Grace carried with her a quiet determination. She did not claim to heal. She did not claim to know the impossible, but she believed in cracks, in small slits where light could break through walls of despair. And as she closed her notebook and set it on the table, she did not yet realize that tomorrow, the very first thread of light would change not only the twins' lives, but the life of the man who thought hope was lost forever. A voice in the darkness. The next morning arrived with the same silence that had long haunted the Hamilton home. The curtains in every room still hung like walls of cloth, suffocating the bright Manhattan day beyond them. The mansion smelled of polish and old wood, perfectly clean, yet strangely lifeless. Richard was already on his way to the office before the twins woke, leaving only Martha and Celia to manage the household. To the staff, it was another day of duty. To the children, it was another day of waiting in the dark. But for Grace, it was the first real day she would step into their world, not as a stranger, but as someone who had seen the loneliness hidden in their silence. She carried no grand plans, no grand announcements. She simply began her morning work with quiet humming under her breath, a soft tune her mother used to sing long ago. She didn't intend for anyone to hear it, but soon Marcus's voice called faintly from the family room. "Who's singing?" His tone was cautious, almost defensive, as if unsure whether the sound belonged to a dream or reality. Grace paused in the doorway, mop in hand. "It's me, Marcus. Just a song to keep me company while I work." Samuel sat up straighter in his chair, listening intently. Sing more. Grace set aside her mop and leaned against the doorframe, her voice carrying a little louder this time. The twins sat still, their small hands folded in their laps, listening as though every note painted a picture they could almost see. When she finished, Samuel whispered, "It felt like the room changed." His words struck Grace deeply. Most people would not have noticed, but she knew exactly what he meant. Sound had the power to shift space, to draw lines and corners in a world where eyes could not. "You're right," she said gently. "Songs can change how a room feels. Want to try something with me?" She pulled the little bell from her pocket again and shook it softly. Marcus leaned toward it instantly, his head turning with uncanny accuracy. "It's there," he said, pointing. Grace moved across the room and shook it again. "And now?" Marcus pointed again, almost perfectly. Samuel laughed, clapping his hands. "I can hear you moving." They began to follow the bell's sound with growing excitement, their bodies leaning this way and that. Martha, who had been seated with her arms crossed, sighed loudly. "Miss Johnson, I told you before, they don't need games, you'll only upset them." But Grace didn't back down. She crouched beside the twins and spoke directly to them, her tone low but steady. "Do you feel upset right now?" Both boys shook their heads. "Do you feel happy?" They nodded quickly, their faces glowing in a way Martha had not seen in months. "Then that's enough for me," Grace said, her voice firm but kind. She looked at Martha, not with defiance but with calm certainty, and the older woman fell silent. Day by day, Grace began weaving threads of sound into the twins' lives. She clapped softly in patterns for them to copy. She walked around the room with jingling keys or humming melodies, and they followed her movements with their heads. She gave them wooden spoons and empty bowls, teaching them to make rhythms of their own. The house, once cloaked in unbearable silence, began to pulse with laughter and tapping, a rhythm of life that had been absent for years. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Richard returned home and paused at the top of the stairs. He heard something unfamiliar drifting up from the family room. Laughter. Real laughter, free and unrestrained. He stood frozen, listening as his sons clapped in rhythm to Grace's song. For a moment, his throat tightened. He had not heard them sound so alive since they were toddlers. Slowly, he stepped down and stood in the doorway, watching silently as Grace guided them. When the game ended, he cleared his throat. "What's going on here?" His voice was more curious than stern. Grace turned, rising to her feet. "We were playing with sound, sir. They have an incredible sense of direction. They can follow patterns perfectly." Richard's eyes softened as he looked at his boys, their cheeks flushed with joy. "I didn't know," he began, but his words faltered. Marcus tilted his head toward him. "Dad, I can tell where people are when they move. Miss Grace showed us." Samuel added eagerly, "It feels like the room has shape when we play." Richard's chest ached at their words. For 7 years he had been told by doctors to expect nothing, to protect them from disappointment. He had believed it so fully that he had stopped looking for signs of possibility. Yet here, in his own house, his sons were discovering abilities he had overlooked. He nodded slowly, his voice husky. "That's good, very good." He excused himself quicksis. Cly, retreating to his study before the tears in his eyes could spill. From that evening onward, Richard began to notice the subtle changes. The boys spoke more, laughed more, and moved with more confidence. Grace encouraged them to explore textures with their hands, guiding them to notice how wood felt different from glass, how soft rugs changed the sound of footsteps. She introduced simple games that required them to stretch beyond routine, to test the edges of their abilities. And every time, she wrote down notes in her little book, careful to observe without forcing. Yet, beneath the progress, Grace also felt the resistance around her. Martha watched her with narrowed eyes, muttering that she was wasting time. The private doctor, Dr. Collins, when informed by Martha of these games, scoffed on the phone, declaring it nothing but pointless distraction. Even Celia, though kinder, warned Grace not to raise expectations too high. "This house has seen too many false dawns," she whispered, but Grace carried her quiet conviction, the one she had forged in grief years ago. Sometimes, the smallest changes lead to the greatest miracles. Late one night, after everyone had gone to bed, Grace found herself standing in the family room, staring at the heavy curtains. She reached out, her fingers brushing the thick fabric. She thought of the way the boys tilted their heads near the windows, how they seemed to sense something no one else believed they could. She whispered to herself, "Not yet, but soon." She knew she had to move carefully. Trust was fragile, and hope could be as sharp as broken glass if handled wrongly. But deep in her heart she believed the twins' darkness might not be as absolute as the world thought. Cracks of light. The days passed, and slowly the Hamilton mansion began to feel less like a tomb, and more like a place where children actually lived. The twins' laughter had returned, filling rooms that had once carried only silence. Richard noticed the difference whenever he came home late from the office. Instead of hearing the faint sound of a television that Martha kept for herself, he heard his boys clapping, singing, or calling for Grace. Their words grew more confident, their steps a little bolder. Yet, while the house grew warmer in spirit, it remained physically dark, for the heavy curtains never shifted. Even when the morning sun poured down outside, the Hamilton twins lived as though it were night. And every time Grace looked at those curtains, her heart ached. She remembered how her brother, years ago, used to tilt his face toward windows, even though he could barely see. "It feels warm," he would say, "like the world is touching me." The memory returned to her as she watched Marcus and Samuel. They tilted their heads too, subtle movements that others dismissed, but to Grace, it was a sign. She began to wonder, what if the twins could perceive something, even just a faint trace of brightness or shadow? She knew she had to tread carefully. Richard had warned her about giving false hope, and Martha watched her like a hawk, eager for any reason to have her dismissed. But Grace also knew that progress required courage, and so she prepared herself for a small experiment. One afternoon, when Martha had stepped out to the kitchen and Celia was busy organizing deliveries, Grace sat with the boys in the family room. They had just finished a rhythm game, their hands tapping on the low table in front of them. Samuel was still giggling when Grace leaned closer. "Would you like to try something new?" she asked softly. Marcus tilted his head. "What kind of game?" Grace hesitated only a moment before replying. "A light game, but you can say stop whenever you want." The boys stiffened. They had been told since birth that light was dangerous, that too much exposure would hurt their eyes. Countless doctors had repeated it, and Martha reinforced it daily. Marcus whispered, "Light hurts." Grace shook her head gently. "Not this way. We will make it very small, very safe. You can say stop if you don't like it." She guided their small hands to her lap, where she had quietly laid 2 contrast cards, one white, one black, and a small flashlight she had kept since her brother's childhood. She did not turn it on yet. Instead, she walked with them toward the window. Her fingers grasped the edge of the curtain. She pulled it just slightly, enough for the faintest thread of sunlight to cut into the room and fall across the carpet. It was nothing more than a narrow stripe, thin as ribbon. She waited, her heart pounding. The twins sat very still. Then, almost at the same time, both of their faces turned toward the narrow beam. Their bodies leaned forward as if drawn by an invisible thread. Samuel's lips parted. "Something's different." Marcus nodded, whispering, "It feels warm here, brighter." Grace's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Yes," she said softly, "that's the sun. It doesn't hurt, does it?" They shook their heads quickly. She stepped slowly into the beam, letting her body cast a shadow over them. Marcus tilted his head again. "Now it's darker." Samuel followed instantly. "You moved in front of it." Their words tumbled out in excitement, their little voices filled with wonder. Grace closed the curtain again, returning the room to its usual dimness. "That's enough for today," she said gently. The boys looked disappointed. "But we weren't scared," Samuel insisted. "It didn't hurt," Marcus added. Grace smiled, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "We will do it again, but slowly, step by step, always safe, always when you are ready." At that very moment, Martha walked in. She froze, eyes narrowing as she saw Grace standing near the window. "What are you doing?" she demanded sharply. Grace turned calmly. "We played a small light game. The boys were curious. They were safe." Martha's face darkened. "You had no right. The doctor said no exposure. You're nothing but the help. You think you can play scientist in this house?" Before Grace could answer, Richard's voice came from the hallway. "What's happening here?" He had returned early, his expression stern as he looked from Martha to Grace, then to his sons. Marcus lifted his face toward him. "Dad, we saw something." Richard frowned in confusion. "Saw? What do you mean?" Samuel piped up eagerly. Miss Grace made a tiny line of light. "We could tell when it was there and when it wasn't." "It didn't hurt, Dad." For a long moment, Richard stared at his children, then at Grace. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Is this true?" Grace nodded steadily. They responded to light and shadow. I kept it controlled and safe. Richard stepped closer, kneeling before his sons. "Did it hurt?" "No," Marcus answered firmly. It felt warm. Tears welled in Richard's eyes as he looked at them. For years he had been told there was nothing, no possibility, only blindness, and now in his own home he saw something he had never dared to hope for. Martha shook her head angrily. "This is reckless. You're letting her fill their heads with nonsense. It's dangerous, Richard." But Richard silenced her with a raised hand. His gaze never left Grace. "Do it again," he said. His voice trembled. "Exactly as before. I want to see." Grace hesitated. "Only if the boys want to." She looked at them, and they both nodded eagerly. With slow, measured movements, she opened the curtain just enough for that thin stripe of light to appear again. Immediately, Marcus turned toward it, his fancy filled with concentration. Grace stepped into the beam, casting a shadow. "Darker," Samuel said instantly. She moved away. "Brighter," Marcus whispered. Richard's lips parted, his breath shaky. Tears finally spilled down his face. "My God," he murmured. They can sense it." For Richard, it was as if 7 years of hopelessness had cracked open in a single moment. A thread of light had entered not only his son's world, but his own. He reached out, pulling them both into his arms. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered, his voice breaking. The twins clung to him, their small bodies trembling not with fear, but with excitement. But even as joy filled that room, Grace knew the storm was only beginning. Martha's glare burned into her, and she muttered under her breath about calling Dr. Collins. She would not accept what had just happened. She would not allow hope to take root so easily. And yet, Grace did not feel afraid, for she had seen the truth in the boys' faces, and she knew that once light had touched their world, no one could ever completely shut it out again. That night, Richard sat in his study long after the boys had gone to bed. His hands trembled as he watched the short video Grace had recorded on her phone, a careful clip of the boys reacting to the narrow slit of sunlight. He replayed it over and over, each time shaking his head in disbelief, each time whispering, "It's real." For the first time in 7 years, he felt something he had thought lost forever: hope. The Father's Awakening. That night after the discovery, Richard could not sleep. For years his bed had felt like a cold and empty island in the vast master bedroom, a place where his body collapsed after long days of endless work. But on this night, he lay awake with his phone in his hand, watching the short clip Grace had recorded. Again and again he replayed it, the narrow thread of light across the carpet, the way Marcus turned toward it with certainty, the way Samuel whispered brighter with uncontainable wonder. Every time Richard watched it, his chest tightened, his throat burned, and something long buried inside him stirred. It was not disbelief. It was not doubt. It was something he had forbidden himself to feel for 7 years: hope. In the quiet darkness of his room, he remembered the first days after the twins were born. The doctor's voices echoed in his mind. They will never see. He remembered Elena, his wife, the woman he had loved more than anything, gone within hours of giving him his children. He had stood in the hospital room holding both newborns in his arms, crushed under the weight of grief, and yet clinging desperately to the belief that somehow he could make it better for them. And now, all these years later, he realized that belief had not died. It had only been buried under despair. Watching the video, he whispered to himself, maybe, just maybe. The following morning, Richard was at the breakfast table earlier than usual. Celia raised her brows in surprise when he entered, because he had not joined the household for breakfast in months. The twins were already seated, eating quietly with Martha watching over them. Grace entered the room with a tray of fresh juice, and her eyes met Richard's. He gave her the smallest of nods, but in that nod there was something different, a recognition, a silent gratitude. He sat beside his boys and touched their shoulders. "Tell me," he said gently. "What did you feel yesterday?" Marcus spoke first, his voice steady. "I felt warm, Dad, like something touched my face." Samuel added eagerly, "It was like the room had a doorway. We could tell where it was." Richard's eyes filled with tears, but he held them back for the boys' sake. "Would you like to try again today?" he asked. The twins both nodded instantly, their faces alight with eagerness. Martha slammed her cup down on the table. "Absolutely not. Dr. Collins has been very clear. Exposure is dangerous." Richard turned to her with a firmness she had not seen in years. "Martha, I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. They were not harmed. They were alive in a way I have never seen before." His voice cracked, but grew stronger with each word. "I will not allow fear to chain them anymore." Martha pursed her lips, clearly offended, but she dared not argue further in that moment. Grace kept her expression calm, but inside her chest ached with quiet relief. For the first time, Richard was no longer just a spectator to his son's struggles. He was beginning to awaken. That afternoon, the experiment continued. Grace carefully repeated the process. The curtain pulled only slightly, the thin beam of light spilling across the floor, the boys sitting side by side. Once again, they turned toward it immediately, their small faces glowing with recognition. Richard knelt beside them, his eyes never leaving their expressions. When Grace moved her hand across the light, the twins followed with precision, giggling when her shadow danced across the carpet. Richard pressed a trembling hand to his mouth, overwhelmed by the reality before him. "You see it," he whispered to them, though he still feared the word "see" might be too fragile, too daring. Marcus nodded. "We know when it's there." After the session, Richard sat with Grace in his study. For the first time, his voice carried not just formality, but genuine vulnerability. "Miss Johnson," he began, "I do not know what you have done, but I cannot deny what I witnessed. My sons responded to light. Not once, not by accident, but clearly. For 7 years I believed nothing could be done. And now—" He trailed off, his hands shaking. Grace spoke quietly but firmly. "This is not magic, Mr. Hamilton. It is patience, small steps, and trust. The boys were never given the chance to explore. They were told light would hurt them, so they feared it. But I have seen this before. My brother, he was also told he would never sense anything. Yet he could detect shadows when no one believed him. I promised myself that if I ever had another chance, I would not waste it." Richard listened, his heart heavy with the weight of all the years he had surrendered to despair. "I have spent millions on doctors, specialists, treatments. But it is you, someone I almost dismissed as just a maid, who gave my sons something none of them could." Grace met his eyes steadily. "I am not asking you to believe in me. Believe in them. They are stronger than anyone has allowed them to be." The words struck him deeply. For years he had viewed his sons through the lens of loss, as victims of something cruel and unchangeable. But now, for the first time, he began to see them not as broken, but as brave. That night, when he tucked them into bed, he whispered, "I am proud of you, not because of what you might see, but because you are strong." The boys smiled, holding his hands until they drifted to sleep. Yet even as hope bloomed inside the Hamilton home, resistance gathered strength outside it. The next morning, Martha placed a call to Dr. Collins, the longtime family physician. Her voice dripped with indignation as she described Grace's reckless experiments. Within hours, Collins was on the phone with Richard, his tone sharp and scolding. "Richard, I hear disturbing reports that your maid is exposing the boys to light. This is dangerous, irresponsible, and unprofessional. You are allowing a housekeeper to play doctor with your children." Richard sat in silence, the phone pressed to his ear. In the past, these words would have crushed him, would have reminded him of his helplessness. But now he thought of the video, of the laughter, of his sons tilting their faces toward the sun. He thought of Grace's calm certainty. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady. "Doctor, I witnessed it myself. They responded to light and shadow with clarity. It was not an accident." Collins scoffed. "Parents see what they want to see. Blind children often move their heads randomly. You are being deceived by coincidence." Richard clenched his fist. "It was not random. It was repeated, consistent. I have video evidence." The doctor's tone grew cold. "Hope can be cruel, Richard. False hope even more so. If you continue down this path, I will be forced to report this as endangerment. You are allowing unqualified interference." The line clicked as Collins ended the call abruptly, leaving Richard trembling with rage and fear. Grace found him standing at the window, his jaw tight, his hands shaking. "They think I am endangering my children," he muttered bitterly. "All because I dared to believe in them." Grace stepped closer. "That is because they are afraid of being wrong. But data does not lie, Mr. Hamilton. If they challenge us, we will show them the truth." She held up her notebook, filled with observations, times, and details of each experiment. "This is our defense. Not hope, not emotion. Evidence." Richard looked at her with new eyes, no longer seeing her as an employee, but as a partner in the most important battle of his life. "Then we will fight," he said, his voice low but resolute. "For them." And so, within the walls of the Hamilton mansion, a quiet war began. On one side stood fear, tradition, and the voices of authority that had declared the twins hopeless from the start. On the other side stood a father rediscovering his strength, a woman who carried the memory of her brother as fuel, and two small boys who had finally tasted the warmth of light. For the first time in 7 years, Richard Hamilton no longer felt powerless. He felt like a father again, ready to defend his son's right to hope. Against the experts, the days that followed were some of the most turbulent the Hamilton household had ever seen. What had begun as a quiet experiment with a single thread of sunlight had become a storm that touched every part of their lives. Grace continued her careful work with the twins, introducing them to small, controlled moments of light each day. The boys no longer shrank back in fear when curtains shifted. Instead, they leaned forward with anticipation. Their laughter filled the house as they learned to identify when the beam appeared and when it vanished, when Grace's shadow crossed between them and the sun, when brightness changed to darkness. Richard documented everything on video, each clip more undeniable than the last. Yet even as their joy grew, the walls outside closed in tighter. Dr. Collins called nearly every day, his voice sharp with warnings and threats. He insisted that Grace was filling the boys' heads with false hope, that Richard was letting desperation blind him to the truth. Martha supported him completely, her words laced with venom as she accused Grace of playing savior only to leave destruction in her wake. Even Celia, who had always been the voice of calm, worried quietly. "I want to believe, sir," she whispered to Richard one evening, "but what if the doctor is right? What if this ends in heartbreak for them?" Richard heard her fear, but he could not let them guide him. For the first time in years, his sons were smiling, curious, alive. That reality mattered more than any doctor's lecture, but Collins did not stop with words. One afternoon, a knock sounded at the door. Grace opened it to find two officials standing stiffly, clipboards in hand. Behind them, Collins's car gleamed at the curb. The taller official introduced himself as Mark Freeman from the State Board of Child Health. "We've received a report of unlicensed medical experimentation," he announced coldly. "We need to observe conditions in the home." Grace's stomach tightened, but Richard quickly appeared, his presence commanding. "This is my home," he said firmly, "and these are my children. You will not speak as if they are experiments. We have nothing to hide. Come in." The officials toured the rooms, noting the curtains, the journals, the small flashlight Grace used, the way the children giggled as they described their light games. Collins followed like a shadow, his tone dripping with superiority. "You see? A maid, not a doctor, interfering with medical care. This is reckless, dangerous." But when Freeman asked Marcus what he had felt, the boy lifted his head with pride. "I can tell when the sun is there. I can tell when it's gone," Samuel added eagerly. "When Miss Grace makes a shadow, it feels like someone walked in front of me." Their voices were clear, their faces glowing with joy. The officials exchanged glances, uncertain. Collins shook his head furiously. "Coincidence. Children often imagine things. This is fantasy." Richard stepped forward, his voice sharp as steel. "No, it is not fantasy. I have recordings, I have logs, and most of all, I have witnessed it myself. My sons are experiencing something you all said was impossible, and if that threatens your pride, doctor, then so be it. But I will not let your pride decide my children's future." The room fell silent. For the first time in years, Richard Hamilton was not the grieving, defeated father Collins had grown used to manipulating. He was a man awakened, ready to fight. The officials left without immediate judgment, promising to review the case, but their uncertain expressions gave Richard and Grace some hope. Collins stormed out behind them, his threats echoing in the marble hall. "If you continue this, I will bring legal action. I will not stand by while you destroy these boys with false promises." His words hung in the air like poison, but Richard did not flinch. He turned to Grace, his face set with determination. "Let him come. He cannot erase what we have seen." And so the work continued, though under a heavier shadow. Grace refined her methods, never rushing, always letting the boys guide the pace. She introduced black and white cards, placing them near the beam of light to see if the twins could detect contrast. To her joy, Samuel began to describe one card as brighter than the other. Marcus hesitated at first, but soon followed. Grace noted every word, every reaction, her journal filling with detailed records. "This is evidence," she reminded Richard. "This will protect them." Richard became her partner in every way. He cleared hours from his busy schedule to be present, to kneel beside his boys as they played with light and shadow. He recorded every session, storing the clips carefully. At night, he replayed them not only to strengthen his case against doubters, but also because he could not believe his eyes. Each small step forward felt like a miracle. He found himself smiling again, not the forced smile of a businessman, but the genuine smile of a father who had been given back his reason to hope. Yet the struggle wore on the family. Martha grew colder by the day, her voice dripping with disdain whenever she spoke to Grace. "You're filling their heads with lies," she hissed one afternoon. "You will leave one day, and they will be shattered when they realize it was nothing." Grace answered her not with anger, but with quiet strength. "I will never lie to them, and I will never leave until they know the truth about their own strength." Her words cut deep, and Martha turned away in frustration, unwilling to admit that perhaps she had clung too tightly to despair. As the weeks passed, progress became undeniable. The twins could consistently identify when light entered the room, when shadows moved, and when contrast appeared between objects. They laughed when Grace made shapes with her hands in the beam, giggling at the idea of light animals on the wall. Their joy spread like fire through the mansion, changing even the air itself. Celia, once cautious, began to smile openly, whispering prayers of gratitude as she watched them. Even Richard's staff noticed the change in him. He carried himself taller, his eyes brighter, his voice steadier. But the storm outside grew louder. Collins published a formal letter, warning that unscientific methods were being used in the Hamilton household. Rumors spread through business circles, whispers that Richard had lost his mind, that grief had driven him into the arms of charlatans. Investors called nervously, questioning his decisions. Richard stood his ground, answering them with a calm that surprised even himself. "You may doubt me as a businessman," he told one shareholder sharply, "but as a father I know the truth." The pressure was immense, but through it all, Grace remained steady. Her faith did not waver because she had already seen what mattered most: the boys themselves, discovering a world they had been told was forever closed. Every smile, every giggle, every whispered brighter or darker was proof enough. And slowly, Richard realized that though he had built empires of steel and glass, his greatest legacy would not be numbers or skyscrapers. It would be the courage to stand beside his children and fight for the light they deserved. By the end of that long month, the Hamilton mansion was no longer a house of despair. It had become a battleground of hope. The experts still circled, ready to tear down what they did not understand, but inside those walls, 4 hearts, 2 children, a father, and a maid, beat in unison, determined to prove that miracles could be born from patience, love, and belief. And though the war was far from over, Richard knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would never again allow fear to dictate his son's future. A world opening. The mansion no longer felt like the prison it once had been. For years, its tall glass walls and heavy curtains had trapped the twins inside a perpetual night. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere began to shift. The silence that once pressed down on every corner had been replaced with laughter, tapping rhythms, and the squeals of discovery. Even the staff who had once moved about like shadows now lingered in doorways, drawn to the sound of joy they had nearly forgotten. For Marcus and Samuel, every day was no longer just a repetition of meals and therapy schedules. Every day now held the promise of something new. And at the heart of this change was Grace, who guided them with a patience born not from textbooks, but from scars of her own. The experiments with light grew steadily more advanced. At first it had been nothing but a thin thread of sunlight on the carpet, but now Grace had introduced them to objects, cards, toys, even her own hand, passed gently through the beam. To her quiet delight, the boys began describing differences in brightness. Samuel would whisper, "That one feels lighter," while Marcus would say, "This side is darker." She never forced words like see or sight upon them, but she encouraged them to describe their experiences in their own language. Slowly they began to use words like shiny and dim, clumsy attempts to describe a world just beginning to open. One afternoon, Grace brought a bright red ball from her small collection of tools. She placed it in the beam of sunlight and guided their hands near it, but not upon it. "Tell me," she asked gently, "does anything feel different here?" Samuel tilted his head, his brows knitting. "It's strong, brighter than before." Marcus nodded slowly. "It doesn't feel like the card. It feels rounder, bigger." Their words were imperfect, yet to Grace they were miracles. For 7 years they had been told the world was forever black, but here they were, describing brightness and shape. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "You're amazing." Richard had been present for this session, and he could not hold back his emotions. He reached for the ball himself, then pressed it into their hands. "This," he said, his voice trembling, "is red. It's a color." The twins repeated the word slowly, tasting it like something new and fragile. "Red," Samuel whispered. "Red," Marcus echoed. It was the first color they had ever been introduced to, not as an abstract idea, but as a real thing tied to their own experience. Richard turned away quickly, covering his face as tears streamed down. He had built towers of steel, created technology used across the world, but nothing had ever filled him with such awe as hearing his sons whisper the word red. At night, when the boys were asleep, Richard often found Grace sitting in the staff quarters with her old notebook spread before her. Its pages were filled with scribbles, diagrams, and memories, many of them dated years back. One evening he asked her quietly, "Why do you fight so hard for them? Most would have accepted the doctor's words and left it there." Grace closed the notebook slowly, her eyes distant. "Because I once had a brother who deserved the same chance. His name was Daniel. He lost his sight in an accident when he was a child. Everyone told us there was nothing we could do, that he should learn to live in darkness, but I could not accept that completely. I worked with him, created small games, helped him sense light and shadow. For a while he grew confident, even joyful. But when he was 15, there was an accident, and he was gone." Her voice wavered, but she steadied it. "I promised myself that if I ever met children like him, I would not let them grow up believing they were broken. I could not save my brother, but maybe I can help someone else find a piece of the world he never had." Richard listened in silence, his heart heavy with both sorrow and gratitude. For the first time, he truly understood the depth of the woman who had walked into his home as nothing more than a maid. She carried with her not only skill, but also grief transformed into purpose. He reached across the table and said softly, "You are giving my sons back something I thought lost forever. I cannot thank you enough." Grace shook her head gently. "Don't thank me. Thank them. They are the ones brave enough to open the door." The twins' progress did not go unnoticed for long. Word began to spread beyond the walls of the mansion. Collins doubled his attacks, calling Richard delusional, accusing Grace of exploiting the boys for her own pride. But Richard no longer bowed under Sue's words. He spoke with calm certainty to anyone who questioned him. "I have seen it with my own eyes. They can perceive light, shadow, even shapes. No one can take that truth away from us." Business associates who once whispered behind his back began to see a different Richard Hamilton, no longer the cold, grieving tycoon, but a father lit from within by hope. Meanwhile, in the mansion itself, the boys continued to blossom. They grew bolder, moving through rooms with more confidence, asking questions about colors, brightness, and shapes. Grace taught them through games, rolling the red ball into a beam of light, showing them the difference between dark curtains and white paper, even guiding them toward the faint glow of a night lamp. Their language expanded. They began to describe the world in ways no one had believed possible. "This feels shiny," Marcus would say. "That side is duller," Samuel would add. And each time Richard felt as though he was witnessing a miracle unfold before his eyes. It was not only the boys who were changing. Richard himself transformed. He no longer buried himself in endless meetings or isolated himself in his study. He spent mornings with his sons, afternoons reviewing their progress with Grace, evenings reading them stories even if they could not see the pictures. The emptiness in his home began to fade, replaced by a warmth that reached every corner. Even Celia, who had once doubted, admitted with tears in her eyes, "This house feels alive again." And yet, beneath the joy, a tension still lingered. Collins and his allies were preparing a formal investigation. Rumors swirled in the press that Richard was reckless, that he had abandoned medical science for fairy tales. The outside world waited eagerly for proof that this miracle was either real or an illusion. But inside the Hamilton mansion, Richard no longer feared judgment. He had set in too much, felt too much, to be shaken. His sons were discovering a world once thought forever closed, and nothing could erase that. Grace often told the twins, "The world is bigger than you think. Every day we will open another door." And with each passing day, another door opened. Shadows, shapes, colors, patterns. The darkness was no longer absolute. It was being pierced, little by rays of courage and love. Richard knew the final test was still ahead, that eventually the world would demand undeniable proof. But as he stood at the window one evening, watching the sun sink over the skyline, he whispered to himself, "Whatever storm comes, we will face it together, because they have already shown me more light than I ever dreamed possible." The day of first sight, the summons came quietly, not through a knock at the door, but through a letter stamped with official seals. It was a notice from the hospital board, demanding a full evaluation of the Hamilton twins under strict medical supervision. Richard read it in silence at the breakfast table, his hand tightening around the page until the edges crumpled. Collins had forced the issue at last. There would be no more private games, no more quiet discoveries in the safety of their home. The world wanted proof, and it wanted it now. For a moment, the old fear tried to claw its way back into Richard's chest. What if it had all been a dream? What if the doctors dismissed every reaction, claimed every movement was coincidence? What if they stripped away the fragile hope his sons had built? But then Samuel's voice broke through his thoughts. "Dad, when do we go play the light game again?" His words were filled with eagerness, unclouded by fear. Richard's hand loosened, and he drew both boys close. "Soon, my sons," he whispered, "and this time, the whole world will see what you can do." The day of the evaluation arrived heavy with tension. Black cars lined the curb outside Manhattan Children's Hospital. Reporters lingered beyond the barriers. Show saws, muting questions, cameras flashing. The world had heard whispers of miracles in the Hamilton mansion, and now it waited for truth or humiliation. Inside, the sterile halls buzzed with anticipation. Nurses moved briskly, doctors gathered with clipboards, and at the center of it all sat Dr. Collins, his expression sharp and unyielding, as though victory was already his. Grace walked beside the twins, her hand steadying each of them. She whispered encouragements, her calm voice wrapping around them like a shield. Richard walked ahead, his posture tall, his face stern. For the first time in years, he was not entering a hospital as a broken man, but as a father ready to fight for his sons. When they entered the testing chamber, the room was filled with specialists, ophthalmologists, neurologists, and observers from the state board. Bright lights hung overhead, machines hummed softly, and cameras recorded every angle. Collins began with his usual dismissive tone. "We will conduct controlled tests to prove that these claims are nothing more than wishful thinking. The children are cortically blind. Nothing has changed, and nothing will change." Richard did not answer. He simply placed his sons in the chairs prepared for them, then looked to Grace. She gave him a small nod. The time for fear was over. The first test was simple. A light was shown in the corner of the room, carefully measured and controlled. "Children," the examiner said, "can you tell us if anything feels different?" Marcus tilted his head, paused, then pointed directly toward the beam. "It's there." Gasps rippled through the room. Samuel followed quickly. "It feels bright." The examiner frowned, checked the instruments, then repeated the test from the opposite side. Again the twins turned their faces, pointing with precision. The second test introduced contrast cards, black and white panels held up side by side. The boys were asked which was brighter. Without hesitation, Samuel tapped the white. Marcus echoed, "That one is lighter." Murmurs spread among the doctors. Collins's jaw tightened, his pen digging into his notepad. Then came the final test, the one that would silence all doubt. A red ball was rolled into the beam of light. "Tell us," the examiner said carefully. "What do you notice?" The room fell silent as the twins leaned forward. Marcus whispered, "It's round." Samuel added, his voice trembling with awe, "It's red." The word hung in the air like thunder. Reporters outside the glass wall gasped, cameras clicking wildly. One of the doctors dropped his clipboard in shock. Richard's knees nearly gave way. He pressed a hand to his face, tears breaking free. For 7 years he had been told never. For 7 years he had lived under the crushing weight of despair. And now, in front of the world, his sons had spoken the impossible. They had recognized light. They had recognized color. They had recognized a world everyone said would never exist for them. Colin sputtered, his voice shaking with fury. This must be staged. There is no scientific basis. But his words were drowned by the flood of evidence unfolding before him. The twins repeated their answers with clarity, their faces alight with joy. The examiners conferred in low voices, their expressions stunned. Finally, the lead specialist turned to Richard. "Mr. Hamilton," he said slowly, "your sons are not completely blind. They possess measurable light perception, contrast recognition, and, though faint, color distinction. It is extraordinary." The words shattered the chains that had bound Richard's heart for years. He pulled his sons into his arms, holding them as though he would never let go. His voice broke as he whispered, "I'm so proud of you. You are my miracle." Tears streamed down his face, not of grief, but of overwhelming joy. Grace stood nearby, her own eyes glistening, her heart swelling with quiet triumph. She had not come for recognition, but in that moment, she knew her promise to her brother had been fulfilled. Outside the chamber, news spread like wildfire. Headlines would soon proclaim, "The Hamilton twins can see light." But inside, none of that mattered. What mattered was the way Marcus and Samuel giggled as they played with the red ball, the way they tilted their faces toward the sun streaming through the hospital window, the way Richard knelt beside them, no longer the broken widower, but a father reborn. As they left the hospital, reporters shouted, cameras flashed, and voices demanded answers. Richard paused on the steps, his son's hands in his, Grace standing quietly behind him. He raised his voice, steady and strong. "For years the world told me my children would never see, but today they showed us that miracles are possible when you believe, when you fight, and when you never give up. My sons are proof that love can open doors even science thought closed." The crowd erupted, but Richard did not wait for more questions. He turned to his boys, smiling through tears. "Let's go home." That evening, back in the mansion, the curtains were no longer drawn. For the first time in 7 years, sunlight poured into every room, flooding the house with warmth. Marcus and Samuel sat by the window, their faces tilted toward the glow. "It feels alive," Marcus whispered. Samuel added softly, "It feels like Mom is here." Richard's heart broke and healed all at once. He knelt beside them, wrapping his arms around their small shoulders. "She is here," he whispered. "She is here in every light you feel." Grace stood at the doorway, watching silently. Her promise had been kept. The boys had stepped into a world once thought forever closed, and Richard had been reborn as a father. The house of silence had become a house of light. And as the sun set over Manhattan that night, the Hamilton family knew their story was no longer one of despair, but of resilience, courage, and the miracle born from love and hope.